What's the price of shade on a hot summer day? New research suggests that the answer might involve decades of racist housing policy. It all dates back to a process known as redlining, where government officials in the 1930s systematically mapped out neighborhoods that they deemed at high risk of defaulting on loans. The racist policy identified predominantly minority neighborhoods as the highest risk. This led banks and mortgage lenders to reject creditworthy borrowers based strictly on their race or where they lived. You may be thinking, what does this have to do with summer heat? Well, let's look at the maps. The concept was explored and mapped this week by the New York Times. Look at this map of Richmond, Virginia. It shows neighborhood federal officials redlined as risky investments because residents were black. 90 years later, the redlined neighborhoods are some of the hottest in town, built with few trees and lots of pavement, which then absorbs heat. Conversely, white neighborhoods that were marked as more desirable in the 1930s were built with more shade. As a result, they are much cooler. This is a pattern that shows up in cities across the country. Vivek Shandas is a professor of urban studies and planning at Portland State University. He's a co-author of the study that the Times story was based on. They looked at 108 U.S. cities and found a trend impacting the way that we live almost a century after redlining. Good to have you with us, Professor. So help us understand how this works. I think it's going to be surprising for some people that there are redline neighborhoods that are actually hotter during the summer.
Right. So when you think about a neighborhood, you think about all the things that a neighborhood is made of. You can immediately start thinking about the fact that there's certain neighborhoods that have a lot more concrete, a lot more asphalt, a lot more big parking lots, some that have more trees. And so that isn't a process of just natural selection like you would see in a forest or a jungle or something like that. These were systematic patterns, as you were describing, that were put in place back in the 1930s, where there were some neighborhoods that were underinvested and historically disinvested. And what you start seeing there is a relationship between certain communities that have a lot more power to push and nudge and even move particular policies so that they can get trees into their neighborhoods, get parks in their neighborhoods, while other neighborhoods are left without a lot of those cooling factors. And so, as you were saying, with the hotter temperatures, there's certain materials like asphalt that will just, in the black and dense materials that are made, really absorb a lot of that temperature, whereas the shade provides a lot of cooling. And in certain neighborhoods, there were allowances for large freeways to go in. That during the 50s really divided up a lot of neighborhoods and also introduced a lot of materials that absorb heat. Whereas in other neighborhoods, they were completely left out of any questions about freeways, any questions about industry, or any land uses that might seal up the ground with a lot of the concrete and asphalt that then further amplify the temperatures that we see in those redline neighborhoods today. So this is a pernicious process, one that was federally essentially codified and allows us to now look in to see what is exactly happening in these neighborhoods in terms of temperature.
Yeah, you know, as people are trying to come to terms with systemic racism and usher in new changes, people might think our conversation about heat seems slightly off topic or minor compared to some of the bigger problems. But in the introduction to your study, you wrote, quote, "No other category of hazardous weather event in the United States has caused more fatalities over the last few decades than extreme heat." Talk to us a little bit more about the practical impact of this temperature disparity.
Right. So I might just start with the idea that, we're naming these hurricanes as they're coming through, as you were just describing, parts of the South in Louisiana, Arkansas. And we have yet to really understand heat waves and the fact that they are killing more people in the United States than all other natural disasters in many years combined. And so what we have here is essentially a secret or a quiet and discriminating killer that is very selective in who it kills. Those who don't have access to air conditioning, those who often can't run their air conditioning if it's too expensive. And what we end up seeing are communities that are often more vulnerable to heat, those that are older, we found, those that are have any pre-existing health conditions are often the first people who die. And what we're seeing is that when a neighborhood has been historically disinvested, that there is a lot less active access to various different forms of cooling, whether that be shade, as we've talked about, or whether that be aspects of being able to find a cooling center near your neighborhood, or even being able to get electricity and AC to your house so that you can run your AC. So it's a real discriminating killer in the sense that we have lots of different communities that are disproportionately affected.
Yeah, it's a bigger problem that we're not going to be able to tackle given the amount of time that we have left. But looking at it from an urban planning perspective, with just a few seconds left, what would you say is the single most important thing that communities can be doing to right these wrongs?
Right. So first off is recognizing that this is something that has happened and that still exists today. That's what our study was able to show, is that things that happened almost a century ago are still present in the way that we feel in everyday experience of temperature and in the summer of heat coming through. And so recognizing that reality is a first step. The second step is really mapping out and identifying where are the hottest parts of your neighborhood, or I'm sorry, of your city, and which neighborhoods are actually much hotter and which are cooler, being able to identify communities that might be most vulnerable in those areas. And then third, to really center those areas and start taking active efforts to be able to reduce and ameliorate some of the temperatures in those areas. So that's at least three immediate steps that communities can start taking.
All right, Professor Vivek Shandas, thank you.